Welcome to Chanel World Story 22, Chanel that always discusses world history. On this occasion, Chanel World Story 22 will discuss prostitution in the Dutch colonial era. So during the Dutch colonial era, many women became prostitutes. Many of them were also made sex slaves during the colonial era. Then what is the story of Indonesian women during the Dutch occupation? Before proceeding to the discussion, I would like to remind those who have not supported this channel, please support this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. There are two options for releasing sexual desires while in the Dutch East Indies: keeping concubines or hiring prostitutes. Between the two options, indigenous women are often the best choice for European men to satisfy themselves. This kind of thing often happened during the colonial period, especially in the 19th century, according to By, 2017. 1. Concubines were native women who not only ran the colonial households, but also slept with them and in many cases became mothers of their children. This relationship is not based on love. These women were not recognized as legal wives and often had to leave or in many cases be expelled by the man if he decided to marry a European woman. Meanwhile, according to the Indonesian National Encyclopedia Volume 13, when the Dutch, who were dominated by men, began to set foot in the Dutch East Indies in the 16th century, most of them were young and single. These bachelors then began to look for native helpers to take care of domestic affairs. Having one or more helpers is important because it is closely related to prestige and self-esteem in colonial society. Bay, 2017. 31. This servant and master relationship then gave rise to concubinage, driven by feelings of loneliness and sexual needs. Masters often make women who act as household servants also become sexual gratifiers. Inside the house, the Nyai manages household affairs, but also lives a normal life with European men who take her as Nyai. He lives with her. As it progresses, releasing sexual desires is not only through concubinage, but also through commercial sex activities or prostitution. The large number of men who had sex with prostitutes made the colonial government issue a regulation in 1852 regarding the regulation of prostitution. Abalahin, 2003. 88. This is done in order to provide more control over the practice of prostitution. This practice is also growing along with economic and social developments. In 1870, the economy in the Dutch East Indies changed to a liberal economy and allowed the entry of private companies. In Bandung, plantation areas are increasingly occupied by private companies. The more private companies, the more the need for workers. Therefore, the number of European men who came to the Dutch East Indies increased. This ultimately affects the demand and supply of prostitution. Abalahin, 2003. 88. The practice of concubinage in the Dutch East Indies. In the Dutch East Indies, more than half of European men lived with a native concubine in the last 25 years of the 19th century, according to estimates. Around 1890, there were some 25,000 European men living in concubines. Bay, 2017. 46 to 47. 53. Apart from concubinage, prostitution was also a common practice. The large number of bachelor men who came to the Dutch East Indies was accompanied by an increasing demand for sexual services. Not all of these bachelors could afford to support a mistress. Therefore, they turned to prostitution to release their sexual desires. This condition also continues because it is provided by the community. Many families in the Dutch East Indies actually sold the daughters for material gain. Hull, 1997. 4. Prostitution is supported even though it is not legitimized by the government. After 1852, a regulation was issued which approved regulations related to the sex industry with a series of rules to avoid the bad consequences arising from this activity. Hull, 1997. 5. Abahir, 2003. 54. This regulation assigns the police to oversee prostitution activities as well as brothel managers. In addition, these public women, a term given by the colonial government to women involved in the practice of prostitution, were given health cards and underwent examinations every week to detect the presence or absence of syphilis. Hull, 1997. 5. Jailani, 2019. 8. Abahir, 2003. 56. Regulations issued by the colonial government can be seen as tighter controls through health inspections, registration. Criticism has never stopped leveling against this practice. Apart from being contrary to Western morality, prostitution is a major cause of venereal disease among soldiers. However, in general, bachelors in the Dutch East Indies still carried out these two things. Helwig, 2007. States that, although in Europe Christian morals demanded to abstain from sexual desire outside of marriage, ideology in the Dutch East Indies allowed a man to find a way out for his sexual needs. Hesselink, 2011. 206. Also states that the many bachelors among all population groups in the East Indies made prostitution an accepted phenomenon, a necessary evil. Abalahin, 2003. Then adds the purpose of the need for these two activities is necessary in the face of what was conceived the undeniable demands of the male libido, so potentially disruptive to bourgeois society as embodied in the honor of respectable women. The honorable woman in this sense ultimately refers to white supremacy over brown skin. Also read Malacca and Portuguese. From a place of proud heart to something not so meaningful. Problems regarding prostitution and concubinage were inseparable from the domination of men in the social structure of colonial society. Trong, 1992. 17. Writes that, in a patriarchal society, social relations between men and women take place in such a way that control over sexuality and prostitution are two sides of the same coin. Namely, male domination, the separation between wives, respectable women, concubines, domestic women, and prostitutes, scandal women, serves only to divide women and strengthen patriarchal ideology, to suppress women's awareness of the general condition of the dependence on men and of being objects of gratification of male lust and the service of emotional demands. The labeling of women and the emphasis on women to depend, especially in economic terms, on men is a real fact in Dutch East Indies society. The economic difficulties experienced by the colonized people ultimately led women to three choices: to marry, to become nyai, or to sell themselves. Sundanese women, concubinage and prostitution. After the decree issued by Governor-General A.J. Duemeyer van Twist on July 15, 1852 regarding regulations on the implementation of prostitution, each resident was assigned to declare it in Dutch as well as Indonesian. However, the announcement of this regulation is not permitted through the newspaper media. Abalahin, 2003. 88. In Bandung, the government started implementing this regulation in 1857. This regulation was necessary to maintain the workforce they had, which in this case was dominated by men. As the Dutch East Indies developed, more and more workers were deployed in garrisons, plantations, mines, factories and ports. However, the locations these men were in were often places where prostitution was present. For this reason, a regulation is needed to protect the health of these workers from diseases that arise due to prostitution. Abalahin, 2003. 93 to 94. The main object in implementing this regulation is the military group. The army was clearly an important shield for the colonial government. Therefore, diseases that commonly infect soldiers such as syphilis, military detention, prostitution, and